When crowns clash with mitres, blood, power and holy showdowns, history is soaked in the blood of divine egos. For centuries, popes and rulers have locked horns in brutal power struggles, each claiming the authority of heaven, each refusing to bow. Kings ruled by the sword, popes by the cross, but both sought dominion over souls and land. These were not mere theological disagreements, they were wars, excommunications, coups and coronations turned confrontations. From emperors dragging popes into exile to popes excommunicating entire kingdoms, the battlefield of faith and politics was endless. When a pope claimed he held the keys to heaven, and an emperor claimed he was God's chosen ruler on earth, someone had to bleed. These are the tales of unholy alliances, shattered thrones and sacred vendettas, where bishops blessed swords, popes crowned emperors, and rulers marched on Rome. Whether in cathedrals or battlefields, the fight for ultimate power between church and state has shaped empires and broken them. Let's dive into the most explosive of these divine face-offs. The investiture controversy, 1075-1122, Pope Gregory VII versus Emperor Henry IV, a medieval showdown over who had the right to appoint bishops. Pope Gregory VII, a reformer, declared lay investiture, rulers installing church officials, illegal, an existential threat to imperial control. In 1076, Henry pushed back, calling for the Pope's abdication. In response, Gregory excommunicated him and in a weaponized move liberated Henry's subjects from their allegiance. Humiliated, Henry trekked barefoot through snow to Canossa in 1077, begging for absolution in a grand display of submission. But the peace didn't last. By 1080, Henry supported an antipope and sacked Rome, forcing Gregory into exile, a vivid portrait of spiritual and temporal conflict. The tug-of-war ended in 1122 with the Concordat of Worms. The emperor gave up the right to invest bishops with spiritual symbols, but retained civil influence. Lesson: when both sides claim divine mandate, humility turns into humiliation, and blood stains the sacred. Pope Boniface VIII versus King Philip IV, 1303, battle for the souls and the taxes of France. Boniface VIII issued Clarissis Lycos, 1296, forbidding secular taxation of clergy without papal approval. Philip IV responded with economic blockades and defiance. Undeterred, Boniface issued Unam Sanctam, 1302, demanding submission to the Pope for salvation. Philip's retaliation was brutal. In 1303, his agent Guillaume de Nogaret, alongside Colonna forces, stormed Anagni and captured Boniface. The Pope was beaten, humiliated, some say even slapped, and released only due to local outrage. He died shortly after, broken in body and spirit. The aftermath sealed the Church's captivity under French influence. The papacy moved to Avignon until 1376. Lesson: when spiritual tyranny meets secular ruthlessness, the result is an empire of lies propped up by fear, and a church turned into a puppet state. Frederick Barbarossa versus the papacy, 1150s, 1190s. In the tumultuous 12th century, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, known as Barbarossa, sought to bring the Church and Italy under imperial control. His vision of a revived Roman Empire led him into direct and prolonged conflict with the papacy. When Pope Alexander III refused to recognize his authority, Frederick responded by elevating a series of anti-popes, rival claimants to the papal throne who would do his bidding. These puppet popes aimed to undermine Alexander's legitimacy and split the Church's allegiance, but the Pope was not alone. Alexander III found a powerful ally in the Lombard League, a coalition of northern Italian city-states fiercely opposed to imperial domination. Their alliance turned the religious conflict into a political and military struggle. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Legnano in 1176, where the League's forces defeated Frederick's army. This humiliation forced the emperor into the Peace of Venice in 1177, recognizing Alexander as the true pope and granting the Italian cities greater autonomy. Frederick's failure marked a victory for papal independence and signaled a waning of imperial influence in Italian affairs. The struggle exposed the Church's political cunning and its growing power, not just as a spiritual force, but as a rival to emperors. King Philip IV of France versus Pope Boniface VIII, 1303. In one of the most dramatic clashes between throne and altar, King Philip IV of France and Pope Boniface VIII battled over the limits of secular and spiritual authority. Philip, desperate for funds to support his wars, imposed taxes on the French clergy. Boniface saw this as a direct violation of church rights and responded forcefully, first with warnings, then with the papal bull Unum Sanctum in 1302. In it, he declared that salvation itself required submission to the Pope, staking a claim to absolute spiritual supremacy over kings. Philip, furious and politically cunning, branded the Pope a heretic and sought to bring him down. In 1303 he sent Guillaume de Nogaret and a band of soldiers to Anagni, where Boniface was staying. They stormed the papal palace, beat the aged Pope, and attempted to drag him to France for trial. Though townspeople eventually freed Boniface, the damage was done. Humiliated and weakened, he died just a month later. This violent episode, known as the Outrage of Anagni, shattered the illusion of papal invincibility. It marked the decline of papal power and the rise of stronger, more defiant monarchies. The Pope's crown was still on his head, but its authority was visibly cracked. Avignon Papacy and the Western Schism, 1309–1417. In a stunning blow to papal independence, the papacy was effectively hijacked by the French crown in 1309. Pope Clement V, under pressure from King Philip IV of France, relocated the papal court from Rome to the French city of Avignon. For nearly 70 years, 7 successive popes ruled from Avignon, lavishly funded, closely controlled, and politically entangled with the French monarchy. This era became known as the Babylonian captivity of the Church, a period when the papacy appeared more like a royal puppet than a divine institution. The scandal deepened in 1378, when the papacy returned to Rome. A fierce political split over the rightful pope led to a shocking development. 2 men claimed to be the true pope, one in Rome, one in Avignon. Then, in 1409, a third pope was elected to resolve the crisis, only compounding the chaos. For decades, Europe was divided, with kings and clergy backing rival popes. This disaster, known as the Western Schism, shattered the moral authority of the Church. The faithful were left bewildered. If even the Pope could be duplicated, who held the keys of heaven? Only the Council of Constance, 1414–1418, restored unity, but the damage to the Church's credibility ran deep and would not be forgotten. Henry VIII of England versus Pope Clement VII, 1530s. The clash between King Henry VIII and Pope Clement VII wasn't just about a marriage, it was a seismic rupture in church authority. Henry, desperate for a male heir, sought an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who had failed to produce a surviving son. But Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Clement, caught in the emperor's political shadow, refused to grant the annulment. Henry's response was drastic and irreversible. In 1534, he passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. With one stroke, he severed all ties to the papacy. The Pope's authority in England was nullified. Monasteries were dissolved, their vast wealth and lands seized by the crown. Catholic loyalists who resisted were imprisoned, executed, or branded traitors. This wasn't just a political divorce. It was a religious revolution. The English Reformation unleashed centuries of religious turmoil, wars, and martyrdoms. While it began with Henry's personal desires, it ended with a nation forever cut off from Rome's spiritual authority. The Pope lost not just one king's loyalty, but an entire kingdom. England would never return to Catholic obedience. A monarch's lust had torn a hole in the fabric of Christendom. Napoleon Bonaparte versus Pope Pius VII, 1804–1814. Napoleon Bonaparte's clash with Pope Pius VII marked the humiliating subjugation of the Catholic Church to imperial power. In 1804, at his coronation in Notre Dame Cathedral, Napoleon invited the Pope to bless the ceremony, only to famously snatch the crown from Pius VII's hands and place it on his own head. The message was unmistakable. Napoleon needed no approval from the Church. He ruled by his own authority. Though initially cordial, relations between the two quickly soured. When Pius refused to support Napoleon's continental blockade against Britain and resisted French domination over the Church, the emperor retaliated. In 1809, Napoleon ordered the annexation of the Papal States. Pius responded with excommunication, a bold spiritual strike. Napoleon's answer: he had the Pope arrested and imprisoned in France for nearly 5 years. During this time, the Church was reduced to a political puppet, its independence crushed. Napoleon dictated appointments of bishops and treated religion as a mere instrument of the state. The papacy, once the symbol of divine authority, now found itself caged by earthly ambition. Though Pius was eventually released and reinstated, the ordeal left scars. Napoleon had shaken the Church to its core, showing that no crown, not even one blessed in holy robes, was safe from imperial ego. The Kulturkampf, 1871-1878. Bismarck versus Pope Pius IX. The Kulturkampf, German for culture struggle, was Otto von Bismarck's fierce campaign to curb the power of the Catholic Church in the newly unified German Empire. Bismarck, a Protestant and staunch nationalist, viewed the Church under Pope Pius IX as a threat to state authority and national unity, fearing that Catholics would be more loyal to Rome than to Berlin. To assert state dominance, Bismarck passed a series of anti-Catholic laws. Clergy were expelled or imprisoned, Catholic schools were closed, and state control over church appointments was tightened. The Jesuit order was outright banned. The Church, once a powerful cultural and political force in Germany, was being systematically dismantled. But the backlash was fierce. Millions of Catholic citizens, outraged by the attack on their faith, rallied around the Church. The Centre Party, formed to defend Catholic interests, grew rapidly and gained political strength. The harsher Bismarck pressed, the stronger Catholic resistance became. By the late 1870s, the Kulturkampf had failed. Bismarck was forced to make peace with the Vatican and roll back many of the laws. Instead of weakening the Church, the campaign had galvanized it. The Kulturkampf proved that brute force couldn't erase faith, and that the papacy, even under siege, could still outlast kings and chancellors. Italian unification and the fall of the Papal States, 1859-1870. The unification of Italy was not just a political revolution, it was a direct assault on the temporal authority of the papacy. For centuries the popes had ruled the Papal States, a vast swath of central Italy, wielding both spiritual and political power. But the dream of a unified Italy under one crown clashed with the existence of a theocratic stronghold in its heart. Giuseppe Garibaldi, the red-shirted revolutionary, and King Victor Emmanuel II led nationalist forces in a campaign to consolidate the fragmented Italian peninsula. One by one, the Papal States fell to the advancing armies. Despite resistance from the Pope's soldiers and foreign volunteers, they were no match for the nationalist tide. In 1870, as Napoleon III withdrew French troops from Rome, Italian forces seized the Eternal City. The Pope's political rule was over. Pius IX refused to recognize the new Italian kingdom's authority over Rome and famously declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican. Though stripped of his earthly domain, the Pope doubled down on spiritual authority. Ironically, losing his kingdom solidified the Pope's status as a purely religious figure, ushering in the modern Vatican as a symbolic rather than sovereign power. Pope John Paul II versus communist dictators, 1980s. In the Cold War chessboard of East versus West, one unlikely figure stood as a spiritual superpower, Pope John Paul II. Born in Poland under Nazi occupation, and later a witness to Soviet domination, he became the first non-Italian pope in over 450 years, and the communist regimes took notice. In the 1980s, John Paul II directly challenged the atheist foundations of communism, particularly in his native Poland. During his visits, he electrified crowds with a message of human dignity, freedom, and faith, ideas forbidden under communist rule. His moral support for the Solidarity movement, an independent trade union led by Lech Walesa, helped ignite a non-violent revolution from within. Communist leaders feared the Pope more than any politician. His words weren't just sermons, they were subversive weapons against oppression. Soviet officials saw him as a threat to their grip on Eastern Europe, even allegedly backing assassination attempts. But the people listened. From Poland to East Germany, Hungary to Czechoslovakia, the church became a shelter for dissent. By the end of the 1980s, the Iron Curtain began to fall, not with guns, but with prayers, protests, and papal courage. Pope John Paul II didn't bring communism down alone, but his influence was undeniably historic and deeply spiritual. Popes and rulers clashed not because of faith, but over power, land, law, and loyalty. Each side claimed divine right, but only one could win at a time. And when both hold swords in the name of God, it's not religion anymore, it's imperial theology.
Exposing religious lies, religion invented by the powerful to control the public. Religion has often been used as a tool by the powerful to exert control over the public, leveraging fear, manipulation, extracting offerings and tithes, moral codes, community identity, contradictions, fabrication, misquoting the Bible, false doctrine, false teaching, and the control of knowledge to maintain authority, the suppressed dissent throughout history. Manipulation, extracting offerings and tithes, moral codes, community identity, contradictions, fabrication, misquoting the Bible, false doctrine, false teaching, and the control of knowledge to maintain authority and suppress dissent throughout history. Manipulation. Manipulation, 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 and suppressed dissent throughout history, throughout history.